For without solid material and technological foundations, we cannot hope to build a great modern socialist country in all respects. No one can appreciate the significance of development more than the Chinese people. I still remember, taking myself for example, I still remember very clearly the condition of my own family and how development of China had changed that. I was born in a rural village in Shandong province, the area that is heavily influenced by Confucianism, both negatively and positively. When I was born, our house is made of mud and straw. The only electronic thing in my house is a torch, and we can only possibly eat meat once a time at a spring festival. And now great changes have taken place, and I will not elaborate on that. We remain unchanged, not only in terms of the above domestic policies, but also in terms of our external relations. Take the China-UK relations, for example. China's policy to UK remains unchanged as it used to be. We still send a lot of students to UK. Myself is a Chiminian scholar, and Sophie, our intern students, is a student of TCO. And Chinese companies still want to do business in the UK. I myself still say hello to many of the professors at Nottingham. However, China in the eyes of UK changed. In the eyes of Japan changed. In the eyes of many other countries changed. Suddenly, there was the ending of the golden era, and the UK Prime Minister began to take China as posing a threat to China. If, as he said, it's because China is an authoritarian state, China remains whatever he described, even in the golden era or before. The same change is also taking place regarding China-Japan relations. In its newly released strategic documents, for the first time, China is taken as Japan's biggest strategic challenge. All overnight, when China thinks that its priority is still development, and we just want our people to live a better and a happy life, China became a threat in the eyes of UK, Canada, and Japan, etc. Please notice they are all the US allies. So it is really important to listen to perspective of our distinguished speakers today, sharing what they understand the 20th CPC Congress. What kind of external relations do they think China would like to build with foreign countries? Why we think we do not change in any way, but we became your threat overnight, and how much the US-China strategic competition, which is, of course, in my opinion, is imposed upon China by the US, plays out in this scenario. So those are the questions I need answers. Without further ado, let me turn over the floor to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Captain Tian. Thank you so much, Tan Sri Ong Tee Kiat, Chairman, Center for New Inclusive Asia, Malaysia, and Captain Tian Shih-chen, Founder and President, Global Governance Institution, China, for your enlightening welcoming address. Without further ado, let me explain to all on the flow of the dialogue that we are going to proceed in a minute's time. The dialogue session 1 is on China's high-quality development and Chinese-style modernization. Each speaker will be given 10 minutes to speak, and at the 7th minute, an alert will be sounded. After all the speakers have spoken, we will have discussants to discuss on the sharing and views of the speakers. In session 1, we have with us Professor Carrie Brown, Dr. John Gong, Mr. Jayant Menon, and the discussants are Professor Liu Yang and Dr. Anna Du. So without further ado, we will first get the first speaker, Professor Carrie Brown, to share his views on China's high-quality development and Chinese-style modernization. Professor Carey, please.
It's a great honor to be able to attend this conference. I had the good fortune to be able to participate last year too. The 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party, held in Beijing in October, created a great deal of interest in the rest of the world, particularly because of the possibility of Xi Jinping having a third term as party secretary, something which was confirmed on the last day of the Congress. However, what is also important to remember is that on the first day of the Congress, on the 16th of October, he made a work report. This was, in fact, in spoken form, just over 2 hours, and in written form, considerably longer, in which he set out the policy parameters for the ensuing 5 years. We think often of the importance of personnel and of the new Politburo Standing Committee, of which there were 4 new members. However, we also need to think about their commitments in terms of policy, and then what they actually will have to do in the ensuing 5 years. In terms of policy, I think it's pretty clear that there are several really important areas which can be called almost macro policy areas, macro policy areas, and these stand over everything else, and everything else can be related to them in terms of what the government needs to achieve and what the administration needs to deliver. First of all, there's the stress on people-centered policy. I think this is important. The Xi Jinping administration is always talking about the need to serve the people. But I think that's because its support networks are, on the whole, a very complex coalition of people who live in cities, some who still live in the rural areas, some who work in business, some who work for government, but all of whom need to see a government that is delivering a better standard of life. And at the moment, of course, the key issues are extremely hard ones in terms of health reform, pension reform, and other things. They're meeting a critical point in which it really is about delivering something, however, with less dramatic returns, because these things take a long time to really bed down. The second is probably a bit more about the emotions of Chinese people, and that's about national rejuvenation. This is something that the work report on the 16th of October also mentioned in some detail. This is really about China's national historic mission now to be a great, powerful country, something which is tangible and within grasp, as it possibly becomes, in the next few years, the world's largest economy in gross terms, and as it may well become increasingly dominant in its region and internationally. National rejuvenation, the renaissance of the Chinese nation, these are old themes, but under Xi Jinping, they've obviously been given a greater reality, not necessarily just because of his achievements and that of his administrations, but because of the basis that was delivered beforehand by, for instance, Hu Jintao, who saw a quadrupling of the economy in his decade in power, and then the late Jiang Zemin, who also had significant achievements, for instance, in negotiating China's final entry with his premier Zhu Rongji into the World Trade Organization in 2001. The third is really more about the nature of governments in China, and that is really about efficiency of administration. Xi Jinping has been fairly ruthless in dealing with officials who have been accused of corruption, and that has then gone on to people in the state enterprises and in other areas of the country who've been accused of corruption. The corruption struggle continues, of course. However, the most dramatic moments were a few years ago when really senior figures of previous administrations like Zhou Yongkang were taken in despite a precedent that they were not usually people at that level kind of actually dealt with because of anti-corruption. Kind of move against corruption has been a really powerful theme of Xi Jinping's era in power, and really bears down this idea that politicians under Xi have to do politics and should not get themselves involved and compromised by business and deeper divisions between the realm of business and economics and that of politics. It's also about a social contract in which government is meant to do things for people and is meant to be seen to doing things. in which it is able to burnish its credentials, as well as democracies, we're always saying that they're able to achieve results in society through policies and policy implementations, and actually come up with solutions to large problems. The very final theme, the fourth of the work report on the 16th of October, was about innovation and the idea of China producing its own research and development and its own technologies. There is, of course, a nationalistic element in that, China having more autonomy and being able to divest itself from some of the kind of influences and dependencies of the outside world. However, it's also true that there can be few countries at the moment that are committing so much in terms of cash and political support to key areas of innovation, from artificial intelligence to life sciences, environmental sciences. So these three areas of people-centered policy, national regeneration and rejuvenation, the idea of efficiency in governance and innovation, give an important framework for what we're likely to see in the next 5 years, but they are very, very high level. For the immediate future, China's challenges are twofold. First of all, its emergence from COVID. The protests in November were responded to by the government in order to ensure that they didn't grow any deeper. In December, there are already surprising signs of how quickly lockdowns and anti-COVID measures are being abandoned. Despite Xi Jinping in October saying that there wouldn't be no loosening up of anti-COVID measures and lockdowns and the hunt for zero COVID, it seems that now China is moving to a position much similar to the rest of the world, in which it will live with COVID and the virus. It will try and have higher levels of vaccinations, particularly for the elderly, and it will just try and have an exit strategy without too dramatic a spike. Figures for infections in China are climbing. A spike is expected. It is a question about how dramatic that spike is, but it seems at the moment the Chinese government is overall in control. However, the longer-term impact is going to be economic, and here what was striking is that the new leadership in October that were put in place did not have a striking economic kind of background. The likely removal of Li Keqiang as premier in March at the National People's Congress next year, and the probable replacement of him by Li Qiang, the current party secretary of Shanghai, is striking because Li Qiang is many things, but he's not someone who's had a strong economic background. And yet it seems to me that in the next few years, China's main challenges will be economic. They will be about trying to reinvigorate growth, because at the moment, according to the International Monetary Fund, China's growth rate is around about 3.5%. The aim next year is to be about 5 or 6%, but that would be ambitious. The second is about trying to do something about youth unemployment in particular, which is also high. The third is about the moribund housing market, so important. 70% of China's household wealth is involved with property, and yet it is at the moment a highly vexed sector, with property developers very, very unable to service their debts, and some of them simply being unable to continue kind of developing properties. This is an enormously important sector, probably one of the most important in the world, and the Chinese government's intervention may well be able to offset some of the problems, but it could well become very, very unmanageable very soon. On top of this, there are the longer-term issues which are going to cost, whether China pays or others. Environmental kind of help, the issue of sustainability, the issue of trying to guard against another pandemic and all the costs that come from that. This is a formidable list of challenges that China faces, and it faces it in a global context where others are in similarly difficult positions. Europe and America are all looking at a very tough 2023. In conclusion, it's important to stress that China's not being able to deal with its problems is not only a problem for Chinese, but for the rest of the world. Like it or not, we now live in a situation in which China's a key part of global prosperity and of global ability to deal with global problems. We will not solve issues like climate change, which are now critical. We witness the droughts, the very high temperatures that were seen in 2022, without China's participation. We either solve these together or we don't solve these issues. It's therefore very important to stress that while there can be very, very serious debates about the differences in values and political systems between China and the outside world, particularly the West, these will not, in the end, really help us in solving the fundamental economic and environmental problems that we face at the moment, which I believe are already very critical. A new form of partnership where in many ways we are able to tolerate quite profound differences in values while identifying similar objectives in terms of policy and looking after our own peoples is therefore very important. And this is what I think is the most important outcome of the 20th Party Congress, the fact that it makes very clear that China has chosen China's way, but it also makes clear that China's way is one which the rest of the world also has to partly walk along, just as much as China has to know that its way is one in which the rest of the world is also a key participant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kerry Brown, who is the Director of Lau Institute of China Studies, King's College, London, UK. Thank you so much for your enlightening sharing based on three important points that Professor Kerry has brought to us. The first one being people-centered policy, where the government needs to serve the people, right, in terms of health and pension reforms as examples. The second point that was brought up by Professor Kerry was about national rejuvenation of China. And the third is on efficiency of administration to fight corruption and ensure that there are proper governance and innovation. So these are the three main points that Professor Kerry was trying to bring to us in his speech earlier on. Thank you so much. Participants who have any questions, you can post your questions on the chat box and also let us know who the questions is directed to. Thank you so much. Without further ado, we will move on to hear from our second distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. John Gong. Dr. John Gong is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics, where he teaches and researches in areas of finance, industrial organization, and antitrust and competition policies. Dr. Gong is one of the recognized antitrust and patent dispute authorities in China, serving as an academic affiliate with Global Economics Group, as well as an expert consultant with the Ministry of Commerce Antitrust Bureau in China, and acted as the chief architect of the Bureau's National Competition Database project. Dr. Gong is a prolific researcher and writer, leading international academic journals, and he is the executive editor of the Journal of Chinese Economic and Foreign Trade Studies, published in UK. So, Dr. John Gong, please.
Thank you very, very much, Chairman Tan, President Tian. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be on this occasion to address this audience. I was asked to address issues about the post 20th Party People's Congress, what's going to happen with China. The first thing I want to mention is that it appears to me that it's going to be a noticeable change of the central government's policy, laser focused on the development of the economy. If people are following with the politics in China, and we all know that for the bulk of the last 10 years or so, the Chinese government, and also the Communist Party in China, have been also very much focused on the political agenda, things related to rooting out corruption, things related to, for example, antitrust agenda, addressing other social issues, things like that. And these things, honestly speaking, do have a cost imposed on the economy. For example, the actual curriculum education industry in China was pretty much affected in the last few years. And I think because of the slowing down of the economy, both due to the political agenda as well as to the pandemic, I think we have China's economy has come to a stage that the government has to do something about it, have to return to the central course of economic development. The toll on China's economy as a result of the COVID is tremendous. If you look at what happened to China's economy in the last 3 years, we did okay last year, but we, very much severely affected in the first year of the pandemic, and economic statistics was just horrible, it's terrible this year. And there's a cumulative effect over 3 years. The unemployment rate is high. The GDP growth is probably in the negative territory next month. So it's about time that we need to adjust our course. And I think President Xi and the leaders in the party and leaders in the central government have been very clear, in my view, that the central focus for next year is going to be on economic development. This is certainly manifested in the recent central government economic work conference. It's spelled very clearly the things will do. So I think from now on, we are probably into a new era of the new era, I would call it. That's a slight adjustment from the past course. It's going to be more on the economic development side. It's going to be more on the growth agenda again. So I would expect that this is going to be the central theme for next year. Now, also, we understand that the zero COVID policy is finally in the process of being behind us. The government is practically taking off, practically almost all the restrictive measures, and the Chinese society is starting to be opening up. The country is starting to be opening up to outside travelers as well. But the experience in Hong Kong, the experience in Singapore, as well as the experience in China right now, and particularly in Beijing, have all suggested that there would be a rapid surge of infection numbers in the first a month or so after the opening up. And this is what we're witnessing right now. Very unfortunately, we're seeing the high infection numbers, particularly in Beijing, as well as a lot of unfortunately death news that we have heard among especially the elderly population in Beijing. And this is very unfortunate. But this is also something probably that the government will have to do. It doesn't have much of a choice. The COVID policy does need to have an active strategy, and this is about time that we have to do this. It's very unfortunate to see this very bad news, and still the numbers are going up, and I would expect the first few weeks into next year, maybe the bulk of January, we'll still be embroiled in this very chaotic situation of infection numbers, and the entire society is still trying to deal with it. And inevitably, that is going to have a toll on the economy. But nevertheless, the experience in the past showed that usually after such a pandemic, especially this pandemic lasting so many years, almost 3 years by now, typically will come back very strong. You look at what happened, for example, in 1918, 1990 Spanish flu. Look at the 2000, I think, it's 2012, the H1N1 pandemic in the United States. We all see a sort of like a Z-shaped recovery pattern. Especially in the Spanish flu, the United States economy underwent almost a decade-long strong growth after that. So if history serves any lesson for us, I would expect that in the next few years, China's economy will be coming back very strongly. We're still going to see some bad news in January and probably even in February of next year. But after that, I would expect it will be all smooth sailing. The IMF predicted that China's economy will be about 4%, a little bit over 4% for next year. But I'm actually more optimistic about that. I think we're probably going to see a number that is a number that is probably a little bit higher than that. Given China's laser-focused adoption of typical tools suitable for this kind of a situation, including monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. We don't see a lot of, we don't observe a lot of things happening in the fiscal policy arena, but these things are indeed happening. I know these things are happening. The Chinese government is pumping money into, again, infrastructure projects all over China. Probably not so much on the hard side of infrastructure, some soft side of infrastructure as well. But these things are happening, and the effect of this on the economy will percolate down to the average folks. It's just going to take some time, and I believe that the government is has to use that policy, and indeed using that policy. Now, in terms of monetary policy, I think China is a little bit lucky and in a much better situation compared to the United States and the European Union, the Eurozone, for example. In China right now, we don't have high inflation. The inflation number is actually quite low, somewhere around 2%, compared to used to be over 8% in the United States, now 7%, and in some countries, in key economies in the European Union, some countries even see double-digit inflation. I think now it's coming down a little bit. China doesn't have that situation. It's only about 2%. So there's a lot of room for monetary policy, for expansionary monetary policy. As a matter of fact, I have seen anecdotal evidences that the banks in China are calling around people, asking them, calling around company executives, asking them whether they need any loan or not. So they're very ready to open their arms to extend credit to many companies. So I would expect that the monetary policy will be quite aggressive. So given these two policies, I think I am more optimistic with the economic performance next year compared to the mainstream international financial institutions forecast numbers. The second thing I want to talk about into next year is about opening up. China has repeatedly said that it will continue to open up. China is in the process, for example, of negotiating the second phase of a free trade agreement with South Korea. And I would expect these free trade agreement negotiations will be continuing with other countries next year. And in particular, I think China's drive to join the CPTPP will probably advance a little bit. President Xi said just a few days ago that he'd like to see the South Korea-China free trade agreement to accelerate. I think that's a very strong indication that China is ready to open up even deeper and open up even more broader. So you look at the inward foreign direct investment numbers in China for the last few months, and the numbers are actually pretty good. Believe it or not, in such a very difficult economic time, and it's actually quite pleasantly surprising to see that to see that the foreign direct investment numbers are still pretty strong right now, and it's just all very good for China's economy. So in terms of the overall economic forecast, I would expect that we will be finally climbing out of this rat hole sometime in the first quarter, and hopefully within the first 2 months of next quarter in 2023. And after that, I think we will be probably on a much better growth track immediately after that. Now, but we do have a big challenge here. That is, in the context of the Sino-US relationship. I think the United States was talking about a policy of not decoupling from China with China, but a policy and focused on building what's called a small yard, a high fence. And I think what's developing in Washington, particularly within the Commerce Department, within that BIS bureau, is something very different. I don't believe in a small yard anymore. I think it's going to be a large yard and high fence. Look at the Commerce Department's entity list. This just keep expanding. And just a few days ago, Secretary of Commerce Randall delivered a daring speech, basically, telling the same message. And I would expect that this line of actions will just continue and be more intensified. So against that backdrop, I think China's response has been a response based on indigenous development. We are already starting to see China's massive development, massive investment in a range of what's called the choke point technologies. And I would expect that activities like this would just continue and intensify. China is probably rapidly catching up in a few key technologies, but still lagging behind very much in several key technologies. And I think it's the government's determination to close these gaps if it can, and close these gaps quickly. So I would expect that investments in these areas would just intensify. Now the implication for this. So in some areas, I would say China is actually not just lagging behind, but also leading. Actually, we know about the telecom industry. The next big battlefield, electric cars and batteries. And I think it's clear that China is leading in these fields. You look at the biggest electric car makers in the world. Today, China is becoming the second largest automobile exporter, surpassing Germany already. And I think it's within 1 year, maybe 2 years, we probably will replace Japan to be the world's largest exporter of automobiles. And associated with that, the batteries. Look at the top 5 battery makers in the world. And China at least occupies 2 or 3 positions on there. So I think these are all very positive developments. And the competition in these areas between the United States and China will be pretty intense in my view. Now, the implication of this is that we are increasingly entering into a bifurcated world. Unfortunately, bifurcation is something inevitable in my view. Both manifested in technology development, development of standards, for example, and some countries, especially I think in Southeast Asia, are caught in the middle and pressure to take a position, take a stand. Fortunately and thankfully, the countries within the ASEAN association have been rejecting that pressure at least, and it is a matter of how long can they hold on into that position. So this is a huge blow to globalization trend. But unfortunately, this is something we have to live up with. It's a challenge we have to answer to. So from China's perspective, I think we just have to deal with that. Even China has expressed in the position that it is not intended to. It's not intending to compete with the United States. It's not intending to dethrone or topple the incumbent dominant position of the United States. But nevertheless, it is forced into that position. And, I think from Beijing's perspective, we're not afraid of competition. But even though we're now hoping we don't have competition, but if it never comes, we'll just stand up to that. It's not a problem. So this is the state of affairs right now. And I would expect that in the global geopolitical context of intense competition between the United States and China, the United States efforts to build a alliance, dragging in some countries in Europe and trying to drag in some countries in Indo-Pacific, according to Washington's jargon. China will answer to that, or which will answer to the challenge to that. And in the meantime, China's companies will continue to expand overseas. And trying to knit what I call a global Chinese company, corporate China, steered and led a global commercial network. Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is part of that. We're seeing more and more Chinese companies expanding overseas, both in terms of from a trade perspective as well as from an investment perspective, and mostly in developing countries. in places like the Middle East, especially the Arab world, in Africa, the sub-Sahara African part of the continent, and in South America as well. And also I want to point out a very important fact here. People talk about, in the history, the establishment of this Pax concept, right? Pax Mongolia, Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, these concepts. And I think we are, for the first time in human history, we are seeing a kind of a similar phenomenon from a commercial perspective, a global network of companies and coming from a particular single country, this is from China. The Chinese company led global network, commercial network. However, this is a global network or commercial version of the Pax China kind of a concept, established only one time in history, the first time, through peaceful means. And if you look at the past Pax concept, it's all rising from sword and blood, very unfortunately. But this is the first time that we have a peaceful rise of a nation, and the expansive role of its commercial influence around the globe in a peaceful means. So I think this is very significant, and I think the significance of that, it hasn't been really recognized, hasn't really been appreciated. So I want to make this point very clear, that even though Chinese companies have been expanding rapidly on a global basis, but this is all through peaceful rise. Everything is based on mutual negotiations, and this is, I think, it works because of that reason, because of that particular reason. It works. It should work well for both parties, both the receiving end of this investment as well as the originating end of this investment. So with that said, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. John Gong. Yes, thank you so much for letting us know your view as to how China will be in the next 5 years. What I've heard very clearly was that the central focus for China will be economic development to recover from the past unemployment rate and lower GDP. And it's also optimistic of the recovery next year, with China opening up more free trade agreements will be anticipated. And that will bring us back onto the past status. And also, Dr. John Gong shared that, with the rapid surge in COVID cases due to the opening of the country soon, supports very well what Prof. Carrie Brown has just shared with us earlier on how China has to stay sustainable if there is another pandemic that is going to happen. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. John Gong, for your interesting analysis. Next, we have the third speaker, Mr. Jayant Menon, who is a senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. Prior to this, he was lead economist in the office of the chief economist at ADB. He joined ADB in 1999 and has worked on the India desk, the Regional Economic Monitoring Unit, the Southeast Asia Department, and the Office for Regional Economic Integration. He is also esteemed as a senior research fellow at the ADB Institute in Tokyo from 2005 to 2008. He holds adjunct appointments with the Australian National University, University of Nottingham, UK, and IDEAS, Malaysia. He has served as a board of director of CDRI, Cambodia, and on the advisory board of the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. He has edited 15 books, more than 40 chapters in books, and 70 articles in peer-reviewed journals. So without further ado, we'll hear from Mr. Jayant Menon. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I thank the organizers for having me here today. I have only 10 minutes, so I want to pick up on a couple of themes that have already been raised. Basically, building on this idea that the 20th Party Congress has one of its key themes, the idea of continuing with China's development and prosperity. And I think that's the area in which I feel comfortable commenting on. I'm not a China expert. I'm a trade economist, but I'm interested in development issues in this region. And I want to hone in a little bit, listening to what the others have already said about the broad trends on China's economic performance. I want to hone in a bit on one aspect which I think has been critical, which Tan Sri Ong has already raised, and that is the remarkable achievement in poverty reduction, and attribute that largely to China's globalization. And driving that globalization or its engagement with the global economy has been its participation in global supply chains. And I think the reason why I say this is because participation in global supply chains is particularly important for poverty reduction. Work by the World Bank has shown how the impact on per capita income is about double that of conventional trade. So 1% increase in supply chain trade increases per capita incomes by more than 1%, double that of traditional types of trade or non-supply chain related trade. So this is very inclusive, and it lifts people out of poverty. And that's what I think we've seen in China. Now, going forward, I think this might be threatened by the escalating US-China great competition. And I think this is the issue that I want to focus on, to look at what the impact of this trade war in particular has been so far, and then say a little bit about what I think might happen from here on going forward. So I think initially, if you cast your mind back to before the pandemic, when the trade war first started and the first tariffs were raised in this bilaterally by both sides, you couldn't pick up a newspaper without seeing reports of firms moving out of China and some firms returning to the US, etc. There was a lot of reporting of how the supply chains were relocating. But these were all anecdotal. But I was interested to know why it was that a relatively small bilateral tariff could seemingly cause so much relocation of supply chains. Now, I guess initially I thought this was because the trade war is being perceived as symptomatic of larger underlying trends at play, which is this great competition, right? And if it's really just a reflection of this great underlying forces, then it's likely to endure beyond any single dispute. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And this has turned out to be true. Not only is it still going on, there's a very real risk of it escalating. So in that context, the quicker the adjustment to this permanent change, the lower will be the costs. And so firms are taking that into account in adjusting very quickly, responding very quickly to this initial raising of tariffs. Now, the second issue, which I think needs to be answered, is how a relatively small tariff could have such big effects. And this is where I think supply chains come into the picture. Now, unlike traditional production, supply chains involves value adding in many countries, as we know. That's the definition of supply chain production. But the tariff is applied on the total value of the product, even if only a small share of that value is produced in China. So for so-called Chinese exports, we might find that only about a third is actually value added in China. In fact, I have measured this for 2019 for total manufacturing. It turns out to be about 1/3 of all so-called China-made products are actually value added in China, 1/3 of it. But again, 100% of the value is applied with the tariffs. So what does that mean? It means that the actual impact of the tariff is 3 times what it actually really is. So a 25% tariff, for instance, applied on China is really 75% on Chinese value added. So a small tariff can have a huge magnified impact on production. So there will be an incentive to move that value addition out of China into countries that compete with China for the same activities. Say, for instance, Vietnam. As long as Vietnam can do the same things at no more than 75% above the cost in China, it'll make sense to move it to Vietnam. And I think that's what we've been seeing quite a bit of in all this relocation reporting. And what we're actually able to say now that we have the data, we don't have to rely on these news reports anymore. The data shows that a lot of these relocations have been taking place, but only in the labor-intensive industries, like textiles, clothing, footwear, toys, etc. These are the ones with low sunk costs and can quite easily be relocated without too much expense. But the key supply chain industries, electronics, machinery, transport equipment, they have not yet moved in any significant way out of China with this trade war and with the pandemic and the zero COVID policy that China has hung on to for so long. This has not had impacts on these very key and significant supply chain industries so far. That's not to say that it will not be affected. And this is the important point. I think if this trade war escalates from tariffs to significant non-tariff barriers, then there will come a point where even these key capital-intensive segments of traditional supply chain industries will end up moving. Now, that will not be good for China. That will not be good for the world. It'll be very disruptive. And of course, we hope that that will not happen. But the signs are not good. We've already heard from Professor Gong earlier about the escalation that's taking place with the Ministry of Commerce in the US. And we can hear about this in other ways. We've seen the CHIPS Act now with the US. And also, not just the US, even Japan has been trying to bring back its affiliates home with huge subsidies. And what we've seen there is that a lot of those Japanese affiliates took those subsidies, returned back to Japan, waited a while, appropriate amount of time, and then returned to China again. So I think trying to reconfigure supply chain using subsidies or even tariffs is not easily done, is costly, and it seems bound to fail. But if the trade war escalates significantly into a real technology war, which involves banning of technologies and the like, then I think we will see, unfortunately, huge relocations taking place and huge costs, not just to China, not just to ASEAN, but to the US as well, and to the world as a whole. So we hope that this will not happen, but the signs, I think, are worrying, but it's not too late to try and, I think, see the bigger picture, see the interdependencies that exist, and therefore the huge costs that are likely to be borne by everyone if we let this trade war escalate into a real technology war involving more than just tariffs, but significant bans and the like that will threaten a lot of the things that have been achieved so far in China, but also in everyone else who trades with China and everyone else involved in the supply chains. So I think going forward, this is something hopefully that all parties will bear in mind, and we will see common sense prevail and find that we can coexist in this interdependent world. I don't think globalization can be reversed. I think there will be trends in different sectors where there will be some increase in self-reliance for various non-economic reasons, and that is fine. I mean, we've gone through that in the past as well. But this idea that we can engineer different types of supply chains and have return to a pre-supply chain world, I think is pie in the sky, and hopefully we won't need to deal with that, and common sense will prevail. So with that, let me thank you for your attention and turn it back to you, Ms. Moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Jayamenen. Thank you so much for sharing the ideas of the governance issues in the region, especially the impact of trade war and the worry of this trade war being moved on to become a technological war. Then it will be some thoughts that we have put in on to ensure that things are well prepared and arranged. Thank you so much also for sharing the going forward of the China's steps in getting the regional collaboration with the countries around China. Thank you so much. Right. Now we'll have the discussants. We have two discussants to share on their views of what has been presented by the three speakers. Each discussant, you are given 5 minutes. 5 minutes for your sharing. So the first discussant will be Professor Liu Ying. Professor Liu Ying is a professor and doctoral supervisor of law school, Sun Yat-sen University, research fellow and project chief expert of Wuhan University Academy of International Law and Global Governance, legal counselor on International Agriculture Cooperation of China, China Council for the Promotion of International Trade Observer of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, Executive Council member of China's Society for World Trade Organization Studies. So let's hear from Professor Liu, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm honored to be here to participate in such a great seminar about post-20th CPC Congress, China's development. I believe that we have already enjoyed very splendid three speeches from the speakers. I just want to share some my learning from their speech. Firstly, about Professor Brown, I'm quite agree that the people-central policy will continue to be pursued by the CPC. And of course, China has developed very quickly in the past 20 to 30 years, even after its entry into WTO. So I believe that China will continue to secure the stability of WTO. We have just have an unexpected successful military meeting of WTO that in this June. China, of course, is a strong support for WTO's further development and its performance of all its functions, including its negotiation functions, and also we want to restore the shutdown of appellate body of DSB of WTO. Professor Brown also mentioned the efficiency of administration of Chinese government. Because I am working on law, recently I really working on a new law draft about the anti-corruption for overseas enterprises of China. We know that China is recently criticized by some Western countries about the corruption of national state-owned enterprises in Belt and Road Initiative and some other parts of the world. CPC and also the Chinese government pay much attention to it. We are now working on a new law draft. Now it's at the stage of legal council working phases. It's still in the initial stage, but we are working on it. That's what I want to share with all of you. Also about the innovation, that Professor Brown put emphasis on. That is also with high-tech production and technology is the focus of the competition between China and the US. Yeah, that's really something. And it's also a great challenge to China's high quality development in the next 5 to 10 years. We will realize that the competition must be intensive. So as for China, I think we need to work along with the rest of the world. Yeah, I cannot be more agree about that. That is also just now Mr. Gong just mentioned. Yeah, we need to get more deeply involved in global commercial network. And I also agree with Dr. Gong that we should be confident in China's further development. The RCEP has taken effect in this year. My base is in Guangdong province. We know Guangdong is quite prosperous in Chinese economy, and we have already done some of the projects for governments to try to dig out the potential or the opportunities for Guangdong enterprises to make full use of RCEP, especially with ASEAN country, with Japan, because we don't have bilateral trade agreement between Japan before RCEP. This is the first time, and also with ASEAN countries. So that's what we are, make every effort to do to get more involved in the global commercial network. Also about Mr. Mellon just now mentioned global supply chains. Yeah, we have noticed that there is escalation of the relocation of supply chains. But just as Mr. Mellon says that, now the relocation is mainly in the field of labor-intensive industry. So China has to take action to try to prevent the more relocation from China, especially in those key fields such as electronic, high-tech equipments, and so on. We are now trying to improve relations with the rest of the world. As for US, it's very difficult, but we can improve relationship with EU. With Australia, we know the Australian foreign ministers are now in China. We have seen the hope for better commercial relations between the two countries. And we also try to have better relations with African countries, South America countries, and so on. Also Middle East countries. We have done much in this perspective. So we also pro multilateralism. We know China has newly initiated a new case in DSB against, export control on high-tech products, equipments, and technology. We know there is protectionism and unilateralism, such trend. But as for China, we need to be more opening up. That's the way we confront world challenges, such as COVID, such as economic development, its sustainable development, and so on. My base is in Guangdong, so I want to mention in the report of 20th CPC Congress, it mentions we should further promote development of Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area. I think this is also a very important point for further opening up and economic development for China. So that's what I want to share with you. I wonder whether or not I have used up my time.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu Ying, for sharing your views on the points that has been brought up for the earlier three speakers. Next, we had another discussion, the second discussion, Professor Anna Du. Anna is an associate professor in finance and research lead of accounting and finance group subjects at the Business School, Edinburgh Napier University. She is the undergraduate curriculum review committee led at the Business School and line manages and provides leadership to a team of academics. Anna's research interests are focused on corporate finance, sustainable finance, financing strategies and investments by emerging market multinational companies, firm governance, bank risk-taking behavior, and performance. So we invite Dr. Anna Du, please.
Thank you, Eugene. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to apologize for not turning on my camera, given my daughter is sleeping next to me. My husband got COVID 2 days ago. Given they lift all these restrictions in China, I'm on holiday in China right now. And I'm looking after my kids, 5-year-old kids, for the past 2 days. Multitasking, sorry about this.
Sure, no worries.
Second, thank you for Capital Tianshi and Dr. Eugene Kim for inviting me to this great event, so I can hear all these insightful thoughts on China and the world of the 20th CPC National Congress, which is a very great, big event, let's say. We got great ideas, insightful thoughts from Professor Kenny Bro. How you managed to wake up this early, Carrie? Even now it's only 9 a.m. in the UK. We've got thoughts from, great thoughts from Dr. Zhong Gong and Mr. Zheng Yin Manon. Professor Liu Ying also have made a great summary and discussion. I will only add a few points before I wake up my daughter. For Professor Carrie Brown, he shared his inspiring ideas on this China's development and Chinese style modernization, including currently China lifts all these COVID restrictions, and surprisingly, it happened. I went back to China for the Christmas break. Still have to go through all this quarantine, and suddenly it lifts all these restrictions, and then we can see there's a widespread infection in mainland China right now. That's how my husband got infected. But though, let's say currently we have been through some difficulties, including these medical resources shortage, etc. But I believe that's a great start for China start to integrate into the whole world again. Given for this, I won't say that's an indicator, but that will be let's say a way for us, like given for the past 2 years, let's say China has its own unique ways to the development, but to lift all these COVID restrictions, that would be a good way. Though, for Karen mentioned, it's due to the protest in Shanghai, or is that but let's say it reached to this direction. I believe that's a right way for China to integrate into the world again, to develop in the future. And I believe it will be more beneficial cooperation rather than conflicts for the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. For Dr. Zhong Gong, yeah, he also mentioned how China integrates into the world, and he shared his big concerns about the next 5 years economic growth. But yeah, let's say again in China right now, for some business are suffering, like the rest of the world, and especially for SMEs, they are suffering at the moment. But I believe with this, like more opening up policies, it will get better. It could be let's say the darkest time at the moment, but yeah, hopefully with this, the opening up policies, and it will get better. And for Mr. Jay Yang, he also mentioned, yeah, the supply chain, the world supply chain, the interdependency and the big picture of the world, and also the technological war. And we know for Huawei, and it has been through some technological war between China and the US and even Europe as well. But when technological war happens, at least it shows we are under great development of technology and be more politicism. Let's say when we start to put our focus on this, which means the technology start to change our life dramatically, and that's a good sign. And with more integration and again policy, that given today the focus is on the CPC National Congress. I believe though they may make few decisions in that Congress, but later it make few changes as well, just like COVID policy. They may start trying to set up in a way, but later it will start to open up to the world again, and then try to have more integration, more collaboration, rather than the war or the conflicts. So let's pray for a better future. And thank you again for everyone, for the speakers and hosts, and earlier summaries, which has done a way better job than I am. Thank you again, and I'm great. I look forward to hear more questions from other participants. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Anadu, for your enlightening speech, a very joyful and jovial one. All right, thank you so much. We have heard from the 3 speakers and also 2 discussants, and we are now into the Q&A session. Due to the time factor, we shall shorten the Q&A session, and we will look at the questions posted by the participant. There is one question directed to Professor John Gong. And the question is, do you think China will have more market-oriented reforms in the near future?
That's for sure. I think you look at the free trade agreement activities. It's very clear that China is ready to conduct more reforms, to more open up. This is already being manifested in negotiation between South Korea and China's free trade agreement. And if you also look at what happened with respect to the bilateral investment agreement between China and the European Union, even though unfortunately this is handing up somewhere in the European EU Parliament. You look at the content of that agreement, the extent of openness that China has made commitment to, that's also another strong evidence. And I think probably more importantly is China's continued push to join the CPTPP. If the CPTPP has a stringent requirements of opening up and other areas that needs to be reformed. So China's determination to push in this direction it seems to me is a direct evidence that it's ready to commit to the kind of reform requirements that is commensurate with the CPTPP membership. So in that regard, I think China is going to further move in that direction. Although I think the past the actions in the past in the last few years has been sort of interrupted by the pandemic. And I would particularly point out that typical of characteristic of the way China does things, it's probably going to be on a pilot basis, as an experimental basis, especially associated with these free trade zone establishment. Some of the policies would be first tried out in these free trade zones. For example, in Hainan, there will be more leeway to do these kind of reforms. So I would say, very typical in China, these things are happening initially on a small scale, but if successful, will be introduced and pushed to the broader market and broader society. So the answer is a resounding yes, in short.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Gong. Right, that ends our first session that talks about China's high quality development and Chinese style modernization. We shall now proceed to the second session, where we will listen from 4 speakers, respected speakers, and a discussant later on the issues related to China's diplomacy after the 20th CPC Congress. So for speakers, you are allocated 10 minutes to speak. Discussants, you'll be given 5 minutes to speak. So without further ado, we shall start the second session, introducing Professor Klaus Larus. Professor Klaus Larus, PhD, is the Richard M. Kresno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. At University of Carolina, he also directs the Kresno Global Events Series, including an Ambassadors and Distinguished Statesperson Forum. He frequently gives interviews to the global media and is often consulted by media organizations and think tanks and international businesses. Larus is the former Clifford Hackett visiting professor of European history at Yale University. He has taught British politics as a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, we'd like to invite Professor Larus to share his views. Professor, please unmute yourself, Professor.
Is that better?
Okay, yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Once again, thank you very much for your kind introduction. That's very nice of you. And I'm joining you today from Ramallah in the West Bank. So I hope the internet connection is holding up and the video is not too bad. What I would like to say is that we have had the Party Congress recently in China, and we can already recognize that it was a decisive step because new policy initiatives have taken place and probably will take place in the future. It seems that Xi Jinping has gained new confidence by being appointed for a third term and by being able to really stack his, as one would say in the West, stack his cabinet with loyalists. The standing committee of the Politburo is certainly severely influenced by Xi's people. Secondly, we already saw COVID demonstrations in China, and though Xi Jinping has gained the reputation of being perhaps not very flexible, of being an increasingly inflexible leader, looking at how he reacted to the COVID demonstrations, we would say that he has shown a surprising flexibility. He did not clamp down very brutally on that. There were some police action, some security action. Some people got arrested. It wasn't all very nice. But on the whole, Xi Jinping gave the order that the demonstrations, that the demonstrators' concerns have to be taken into account. And zero COVID now seems to be largely a thing of the past. So zero COVID has gone. However, or at least will be going in the very near future. However, we have seen COVID wave in China. We now know that the economic repercussions of the pandemic will not be easily overcome now because of that COVID wave. And still, we saw a surprising flexibility by Xi Jinping, how he reacted to the demonstrations. I would like to make 2 points, 2 geopolitical points. One, regarding GGP's activities in the international arena. And secondly, I would like briefly to talk about the Ukraine war. First of all, I think we have seen a new flexibility by Xi Jinping that included a geopolitical charm offensive. He has received Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, in Beijing. He has talked to Emmanuel Macron, the French president. He even met with Biden at the G20 summit. He went to Saudi Arabia and conducted a very active diplomacy in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. And he has also continued his charm offensive toward Africa and other developing countries. That shows that Xi Jinping wishes to be present again in the geopolitical arena, that the pandemic, where China was largely focusing on fighting the pandemic, where Xi Jinping didn't leave his own country for many months, that has been overcome. And I think the conclusion is that Xi Jinping wants to woo the Western world increasingly and wants to woo countries in the Middle East, of course, for economic reasons, for energy reasons, but also, I think, for geopolitical reasons. It seems to have become realized in China that China's image geopolitically during the pandemic has plummeted in many parts of the world, that China increasingly, particularly, of course, in Europe and the United States, has been seen as a pariah in world affairs, has been seen as the odd man out, if you like. And I think there's a serious initiative to overcome that, to improve China's image by going back to the past, really, by re-engaging in a global way, by making sure that globalization, as one of the previous speakers said, that globalization indeed will continue and has not ended. And of course, there also is the further dimension that China is still trying to divide the Europeans and the United States from each other. There's a very different policy towards Europe, particularly towards France and Germany, than there is Beijing's policy towards the United States. But also this is nothing new. So, I think his charm offensive is really going back to the past by reconnecting, re-engaging with China's traditional global foreign policy. Regarding these individual talks, just a word about that. Particularly interesting was perhaps, apart from his talk with Biden at the G20, perhaps particularly interesting was Xi Jinping's talks with Olaf Scholz in Beijing. It was, of course, as we know, a very fleeting visit. Scholz was, I think, hardly longer than 24 hours on the ground in Beijing, not least for COVID reasons. He was not able to mingle with the public. He was only able to see a selected number of ministers and officials. And still, he brought a large business delegation with him. And clearly, the aim of Olaf Scholz, like in the past, was twofold. It was, first of all, an economic aim, a trade aim to improve relations, clearly. And that was, I would say, as far as we know, and of course, we don't know all the details of the visit. We don't know all the agreements which were entered into. But on the whole, we can say that trade and economic part of his visit was successful, that many agreements were concluded of a trade nature, so that German-Chinese relations in an economic way have certainly been improved by that visit. Secondly, it was, of course, a personal visit, a personal encounter, so a visit which was meant to overcome that increasing tension in German-Chinese relations as well by personal reconnection between the major leaders of both countries. And in that respect, it probably was successful as well. Olaf Scholz also claimed credit for saying that he talked to Xi Jinping about Putin's threat of the use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war. Personally, I think this is probably an exaggeration on Olaf Scholz's part. He may have talked to Xi about it, but I'm not sure that Olaf Scholz was the one who managed to bring the world away from the brink of perhaps the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So here, Olaf Scholz, I believe, claims more credit than is really due to him. But on the whole, that visit reconnected to the traditional German-Chinese relationship in a successful way. How that will continue, we will have to see. That brings me to my second point, that is the Ukraine war. And China's reputation in the Western world has plummeted for trade reasons, as we also heard. The trade war is still continuing. But I think what is also very important is the Chinese position in the Ukraine war and its siding, at least its indirect siding with Russia. China still has not condemned the war. It tries to sit on the fence. It tries to be neutral, but it is very much a pro-Russian neutrality. It has increased its energy deliveries from Russia at a very favorable, cheap price. It is not breaching any sanctions, as we know. China is not delivering ammunition and weapons to Russia, as far as we know. But China goes as far as it can without breaching sanctions, without being perhaps running the danger of being penalized for its siding with Russia. What would be, and also and here Xi Jinping deserves credit. Apparently, Xi Jinping has talked to Putin about Putin's, until recently, frequent reference to the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons and may, under certain conditions, use these nuclear weapons in Ukraine, at least tactical nuclear weapons or dirty bomb or something like that. And since Xi Jinping talked to Putin, and since there were also meetings between American intelligence chiefs and Russian intelligence chiefs and the American National Security Advisor and his Russian counterpart, ever since Putin has really not referred to Russia's nuclear weapons again. And of course, both these intelligence directors on both sides, on the Russian and American sides, but also Xi Jinping deserves credit for having really told Putin what he does by referring to nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war is totally irresponsible and unacceptable to anyone, including Putin's friends in the international arena.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, you have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Do you hear me? One final word before I would like to finish is, if Xi Jinping was serious of improving its relations with the United States and Europe in a more constructive way, I think there is room for China being more active regarding mediation in the Ukraine conflict. Xi Jinping has very good relations with Putin. Putin probably trusts him more than many other leaders in the world. So Xi Jinping has room for convincing Putin that the war cannot continue for another 10 or 11 or 12 months, that some sort of compromise needs to be found. And of course, that is difficult. We know the Ukrainian position. We also sort of vaguely knew what Putin has in mind. So Putin's war aims have become very diffuse, are very unclear to, I think, anyone. Still, there is room for Xi Jinping to become involved a little bit more actively, perhaps behind the scenes, to push Putin into a position which is much more constructive regarding Ukraine. I believe that increasingly China also views the Ukraine war as an increasing liability. Yes, the United States is distracted by the Ukraine war, but it has become clear that attention regarding the South China Sea, regarding Taiwan, is still pretty strong in the United States, despite the Ukraine war. So increasingly, also when we look at supply line channels, which are increasingly made difficult because of the Ukraine war, energy problems, food problems, I think increasingly China realizes that also for China and much of the world, the Ukraine war has become a liability. So if Xi Jinping wanted to improve its international image, then I think Ukraine would be the right point to start to show maybe international statesmanship, which of course China always claims that it has a lot of that. And here we and China and Beijing could prove it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Laris, for your enlightening viewpoints on what shall be done, in China to look forward to the years to come. Right. Due to some unforeseen circumstances, we have to invite Professor Ranamita to speak first. And after Professor Ranamita, Dr. Chow Hai will be speaking. So let me introduce Professor Ranamita. He's a professor of the history and politics of modern China at the University of Oxford and vice president public engagement of the British Academy. His work focuses on the emergence of nationalism in modern China, both in the early 20th century and in the present era. He is the author of several books, including Modern China, A Very Short Introduction, and the award-winning A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World. Professor Rana also writes China's War with Japan, 1937 to 45. The Struggle for Survival was named as 2013 Book of the Year in the Financial Times and The Economist. So without further ado, please, Professor Ranamita, for your sharing.
Thanks very much to Dr. Key for his kind welcome to the forum, for the chance to speak to this distinguished company and to all the organizers. I will follow up on Professor Laris's very interesting points by basically giving a quick take on some of the ideological inputs that I think may be worth thinking about in terms of changing Chinese foreign policy in the next few years. And in doing that, I want to step away slightly from the specifics. Obviously, we can and should talk about relations between between China and the US, China and Europe and so forth, and we'll continue to do that. But I think a brief discussion of some of the concepts which seem to me interesting, and I'll name three in particular, is useful at this point. And in doing so, I'm taking my lead in discussion from one of the most interesting documents that has been produced by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party in the last few years. And that was just over a year ago in November 2021, with the resolution on party history that was issued publicly by the party as a means of looking over its past 100 years of history from 1921 to 2021. 1921, of course, being the founding year of the party, and then connecting that to future aims and ambitions, including in foreign policy. And I'll mention now what those 3 points are that I'd like to make, and I'll just speak for 2 minutes or so on each of those and hopefully stimulate some discussions and comparison. The 3 points I want to make are that there are 3 factors which broadly I would call ideological or thought-based, that I think in different ways are going to shape foreign policy for some time to come. Number 1 is the impact of China's own modern history in shaping mindsets, metaphors, and analogies about China's future direction in the world. Number 2 is the return of interest, which has been going on for more than 30 years, but I think is strong and explicitly endorsed these days by the party leadership, which is the return of pre-modern Chinese philosophical thinking from a variety of sources. Sometimes the shorthand for that is Confucian thinking, but actually I think that the range is wider than just Confucius. And the third point is the return of the serious discussion of Marxism as a way of thinking about what Chinese socialism means, both at home and in the world. Xi Jinping calls himself a 21st century Marxist. I think we should take him seriously when he says that and try and analyze what it is that term might actually mean. Again, I apologize that in 2 or 3 minutes, I can't say too much about that in terms of some of the analytical depth, but I hope to put forward a few ideas that will be useful for thinking through these issues. So let me go briefly through each of those 3 one by one. The first is the question of modern history. As Dr. Key has pointed out, very kindly pointed out, I've spent most of my professional life as a historian of 20th century China, particularly the 30s and 40s. And I must say that it strikes me that the level of usage of analogies and emotionally resonant ideas from China's own often very troubled modern history seems to show no signs of slowing down in the 2010s and 2020s. So when the COVID outbreak began in spring 2020, it was in a sense natural that the party would reach for the term People's War to describe the way in which this country would fight against the virus. And that term, of course, brings to mind to any educated Chinese listener, indeed to many overseas as well, memories of the Second World War period, when conceptions of People's War were developed by Mao Zedong, Lin Biao, Peng Dehuai, and other thinkers of that time. I say this because these are not necessarily natural reference points for Westerners who don't spend a great deal of their time thinking about this era of Chinese history. And I think I want to stress the way in which, as a natural go-to, as a natural place of reference, this era of modern history still has a lot of significance in terms of understanding the wider trajectory of China's policy and decision makings. I am not suggesting for a minute that modern history is the only way to think about that decision making. But just as I think you can't understand my own country, the United Kingdom, without understanding the importance of that mid-20th century period, no longer in living memory, but still in collective memory, I think the same is also very much the case for for China as well. One other example in 2020 also, it was the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War. And again, I wasn't surprised that everywhere from social media to, of course, the blockbuster movie, or one of the blockbuster movies of that year, The Fire on Haijin Lake, we had many mentions of the Korean War, particularly in its Chinese context of Kangmei, resistance to America, which, of course, in the context of the very fierce US presidential election of that year, and an election in which, of course, Donald Trump, the incumbent president, was speaking very robustly against Chinese foreign policy in the world, that this particular historical metaphor became quite powerful. We can think of many other examples. The Opium Wars are another obvious one, but it's a reminder that history is never just history in China. It is also current affairs and foreign policy. Let me move quickly to point number 2 about Confucian and broader philosophical thinking. And again, let me cut to the chase and explain why I think that over time, in historical time, this is a significant shift. Historians and even non-historians will know that one of the things that defined the Chinese Communist movement in the early 20th century, all the way through the Cultural Revolution, was its rejection of Chinese traditional thinking. The Wusi, the May 4th movement, was perhaps one of the most important elements of that rejection, when great modern writers like Lu Xun talked about Confucianism and traditional thinking as being a feudal relic that was akin to cannibalism or other inhuman actions. Today, of course, and really ever since the 1990s or even 1980s, the Chinese Communist Party has gone in exactly the opposite direction and re-embraced pre-modern Chinese philosophical thinking. So because of reasons of time, let me just mention one famous example, which I think will be known to many. The political philosopher and advisor Zhao Tingyang, who is perhaps one of the most prominent thinkers in the Chinese Academy today, talking about concepts such as tianxia, sometimes translated as the empire or all under heaven. The point being, it is not a Westphalian, not a late modern conception of how international relations work, but rather it is a way of thinking about how pre-modern Chinese thinking might be modernized for the contemporary world of the 21st century and used to think again about China's place in the world. Zhao Tingyang is not the only voice on this in China. There are others there who debate with him very openly and robustly, but he's an important example of how that kind of thinking, I think, once again, is very active in policy-making circles in China, particularly ones which think about the wider historical perspective. And the final example I want to give, as I've said, is to reassert the importance of what is in the name of the Chinese Communist Party in terms of both its domestic and its international policy, and that is Marxism. Marxism, not in the 20th century form of class struggle, I think the violent struggle of Tugai, the land reform, which marked the revolution in the 1940s and 50s, is unlikely to return to China in the present day. But the modes of thinking that draw from an intellectual tradition that Marxism has had for over a century in China are still there. Marx himself, after all, was not the originator of his mode of thinking, of the thesis and the antithesis producing a synthesis. He drew that from Hegel, and plenty of early 20th century Chinese thinkers, of whom Mao was only one, in fact, although in the end one of the most influential, drew on that thinking to then create a Chinese version of Marxism, which drew on its original thinking and is still very much praised by the party today, but nonetheless takes into account the way in which China has a very different sort of economic and social setup from Germany or Britain or the other countries that Marx studied. Two concepts, I think, in particular, sit very much in the rhetoric of every essay you read in Qiushi, the theoretical journal of the party, or indeed speeches from figures including Xi Jinping, Wang Yi, and others. One term is dozhou, struggle, which expresses, I think, very well that idea of thesis and antithesis in terms of anything from the US-China relationship to actually the struggle between the desire for economic growth and the desire for green energy development. It doesn't have to be an antagonistic struggle. The other term is Maodun, contradiction. And again, the ideas of fundamental contradictions, ideas that don't fit with each other but need to be worked through, again sits very centrally at the way in which the Chinese Communist Party is dealing with the way that it characterizes what seems to be happening in a turbulent world. That phrase that we remind ourselves of, that we see today, changes that have not been seen in a century or have not been seen in 100 years. I think, frankly, most of the world feels that way, including the Western world. We live in times that, from climate change to war, are unprecedented. But at the same time, drawing again on a theoretical framework of Marxism that helps to explain some of those ideas has been an important part of the Chinese mixture. What we have to see again is that the mixture of these issues, history, Confucianism, Marxism, economic progress, have their own contradictions, but I think they point us towards the differing incentives that will shape Chinese foreign policy for some years to come. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, and a pleasure and honor to be part of this distinguished forum today.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ranamita. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ranamita, for your sharing. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Zhao Hai. Dr. Zhao Hai is the Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, one of the top government-affiliated think tanks. He is concurrently a research fellow at the Institute of World Economics and Politics, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and a non-resident fellow of the Global Governance Institution. Dr. Zhao has done research on topics ranging from China-US relations, China's foreign policy to global governance, and previously worked as a research fellow at the National Strategy Institute of Tsinghua University, and held various positions at think tanks in Chicago and Washington, D.C. in the United States. So please, Dr. Zhao Hai.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Qi. And it's a great pleasure to be invited and to participate in this forum. And I appreciate all the previous speakers talking about all the important issues related to the 20th CPC Party Congress and also China's domestic and international policies. It's particularly interesting of what Professor Ranamita talked about, the concept. He provided a very interesting framework to understand Chinese Communist Party's important concepts and how they will work on top of this concept and trying to expand its influence in the world. So currently, as you know, that also previous speakers talk about the pandemic situation in China and how that situation is quickly evolving in the past couple of days. As far as I know, right now, probably already 250 million Chinese people are infected, and this rate is continuing to increase. And predictably, I think China will reach its peak probably next month. And then for the next couple of months, 2 to 3 months, China will gradually recover from that, and with that, the economy will gradually recover. But this is a very long process, and I think because of lack of preparation for this sudden reopening, currently the medical system is under great pressure, and hopefully the whole country will go through this, and less people will die from it. However, the impact of the pandemic is very grave, and particularly concerning 2022. On the one hand, the domestic economy, domestic demand is basically suffocated because of the pandemic, and also international demand is also decreasing because the U.S. increasing its interest rates on top of the rapid inflation. And right now, the inflation is gradually curbed. However, it maintained at a relatively high level. At the same time, the U.S. probably will continue to raise its rates to close to 5% and making the international demand gradually shrinking for China. So by the year 2023, I agree with other speakers that China will face a very difficult headwind. And because of that, the Chinese government has made it very clear through the last meeting, the economic working meeting, and also the 20th Party Congress, that the party will focus on economic side, on economic development next year, and will pull all the potential and possible policies to support the growth, domestic demand, and also trying to expand global market. So I think even though the party's 20th Party Congress is focused on China's domestic politics, but its ramifications, and particularly for the next couple of years, dealing with domestic challenges and international challenges, are going to be significant. One thing that we've talked about in the previous session, which is about supply chain, I want to emphasize that right now the global value chain is probably even more important in the competition between China and the U.S. On the one hand, yes, the supply chain is changing, but some of the because of years of China's working on the global supply chain, it has maintained quite sustainable a role in that supply chain. So even though the U.S. imposed tariffs and other measures against China, but over the years, China's export had maintained relatively stable. And China has the confidence in the future to maintain a majority part, particularly a sophisticated part of the supply chain within China, even though the labor-intensive part would likely go to other countries in Southeast Asia, India, and Mexico. But I want to put more emphasis on the global value chain, because that's the part where the Communist Party will focus on, and also that's where the U.S. is focused on. Because China in recent years is in competition with the U.S., particularly in those areas of high tech and this. I'm sorry.
I'm here, but I just need to meet you. Yeah. 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
All right. Okay. So in the global value chain, China is gradually climbing the value chain and developing its domestic technology based on its own market. And that growth is gradually in direct competition with advanced Western countries and the US in particular. So that's where China-US competing severely, and the US trying to contain China. Using export controls, using all kinds of investment screening, and right now the U.S. is actually using industrial policy, learning from China to develop its own chip industry, which and also green technology, which has incurred potential retaliation from European countries. So all these means that in the future, I think because of this kind of competition on the value chain, China and US will probably intensify its competition, which makes potential parallel system in high tech between the two countries, where the US is on the one side, continue to invest in their technology, and China on the other side also declared investing more than $1 trillion for the chip technology in the future. So that's what China is facing, but another thing is geopolitics, and China is probably facing more difficulties in that area. Previously, Professor Laurie talked about the Russian-Ukraine war. And indeed, China is having difficulties trying to solve this problem because on the one hand, China is getting closer with Russia to balance out the pressure from the United States, the growing pressure from the United States. However, China did not foreseen that the Russians would take military action against Ukraine, and also did not expect such a backlash from the Western world. Sanctions on Russia and also export controls, all the voluntary multinationals withdrawals from Russia, which makes the situation very complicated. And China is walking a thin line, trying to maintain neutrality. On the one hand, maintain normal trade relations, normal country-to-country relations with Russia, but on the other hand, trying to save its relationship with European countries. But so far, I think Eastern European countries, particularly the Baltic countries, are having a huge problem with China on this issue. But secondarily, other than that, there's a more serious issue because of Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is that the West is now focused on Taiwan, and that issue is probably giving more headache to the Chinese leadership after the 20th Party Congress, even though China is pursuing a reunification ultimately, and that's becoming a central part of that China's foreign policy, and also central part of China's so-called national rejuvenation. However, China has no urgency to resolve the Taiwan issue right now. However, the Taiwan card has been played by the US side, pushing and escalating the situation across the Taiwan Strait, making this an even more complicated issue for the next couple of years when the US is putting more resources and in particular, passing laws to support diplomatically Taiwan's international status. So overall, I think it's important if you look at the post 20th Party Congress, China's foreign diplomacy, it's very clear that China is putting on a charm offensive globally. On the one hand, extending people-to-people connections, and there are more and more, I think we will see more 1.22 track communications between China and international organizations and other think tanks around the world. And secondarily, that China will develop its relations with its neighbors. You can see that President Xi Jinping has met with leaders from Vietnam, Laos, Indonesia, Mongolia, all those neighbors, and developed new projects along the BRI. And also China, I think, will focus on some of the international or regional organizations like Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also BRICS to counter the US regional and global organizations try to pressure China. And finally, I think China will find more openings in developing countries. As you can see that China has, President Xi has visited Middle East recently, and basically uplifting its relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think early next year, China will follow its tradition to visit Africa, also Latin America, increasing its ties with all those regions. And I think in this particular geopolitical tension, it's very important for China to having all those regional connections and develop those regional connections to expand its market and build more, other than trade, more political and security relations with those regions. So one final word is that in the 20th Party Congress, President Xi has made it very clear that China's Chinese-style modernization is focused on peaceful development, and peace and development are still be the two keywords for China's future policy. So that's why I think China's global security and global development initiatives are the two pillars for future China's policies after the 20th Party Congress, and development will be the focus on China's relations with all the developing countries. And that's the part that where China will continue to follow so that China can counter the US pressure and continue to compete with the US geopolitically and technologically. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zhao Hai. Thank you so much. for your sharing. Right, next we will hear from Professor Jin Sok Yuen, Professor at College of Law, Sokmyung Women's University, Korea.
Hello, my name is Jin Sok Yuen. I'm a professor at Sokmyung Women's University, Seoul, South Korea. And I thank you for inviting me to speak on the China in the World Conference. First of all, my congratulations on new Chinese Communist Party and government leadership. I will make a very brief remark on China and the world from a position of one of China's neighbors. China, my understanding of China's position is China aspire to obtain real big power position. It's very natural development of a country. In order for a country to become a big power, it must have three essential elements of power. They are military power, economic power, and international leadership or political power. China has already built up sufficient economic power with $18 trillion GDP, which is 18% of whole world GDP in 2021. While those of the US were $23 trillion, which is 24% of the world GDP. There is not much difference between $18 trillion and $23 trillion. In terms of military power as well, China also has taken up a third position after US and Russia in the global firepower military ranking. Considering that Russia has been suffering in the Ukraine war, it is pretty clear that China has already taken up second position militarily as well. So China has already built up sufficient power base in economic and military area. In the area of international leadership or political power, however, even though China has expanded its role and contribution in many international organizations such as WHO or even UN Security Council, China has not shown impressive achievements in this area. International leadership is nothing but China's sacrifice for the benefit of other countries or international society. In this regard, the crisis that North Korean nuclear weapon brought is a good opportunity for China to show the world that it is willing to work for the benefit of international society. North Korean nuclear weapon has been a problem for almost 3 decades in the world, and in particularly in Northeast Asia region. North Korea successfully conducted nuclear tests 6 times, which is enough to build up a nuclear bomb. So it is estimated that North Korea has nuclear fissile material for 50 warhead, along with 30 already assembled warhead. So they are holding the nuclear bomb in their hand. North Korea launched various missiles such as short-range, middle-range, and long-range international ballistic missile and cruise missiles. It is estimated that North Korea has almost completed nuclear warhead and missile system, except a couple of issues such as warhead miniaturization, multi-warhead, re-entry of ballistic missile, and precision guide system. And they're working on it. If they are not stopped, they will complete all those missing parts in the near future. In response, international society, particularly United Nations, took a certain measures to stop North Korea's nuclear weapon development program. United Nations Security Council adopted more than 10 resolutions, starting from Resolution 1718 in 2006 all the way to Resolution 2397 in 2017. Those resolutions has a status of international law, and those resolutions made clear that North Korea's nuclear weapon is illegal. So it is very simple and clear. North Korea's nuclear weapon is illegal. If North Korea is not stopped at this moment, we have to face very serious situation, which is consequences of North Korea's nuclear weapons. North Korea's nuclear weapon is a direct threat to South Korea, Japan, and the United States. And particularly for North Korean nuclear weapon is a direct threat to South Korea and Japan and the United States. The three countries has made effort to stop North Korean nuclear weapon program. However, once North Korea crosses the red line, those three countries will have to take countermeasures, which is building their own nuclear arsenal. North Korea's nuclear weapon is a direct threat to South Korea and Japan. For two countries, North Korea's nuclear weapon is life and death matter. Japan has already made effort to equip itself the capacity to strike enemy base, thereby ending its exclusive defense policy as a defense policy. Inside South Korea, there has been numerous suggestions these days for nuclear armament in case of North Korea's completion of nuclear weapon system. The U.S. publicly announced that it will strengthen its military presence in Northeast Asia if North Korea nuclear program crosses a certain line. That means three countries will take certain countermeasure when North Korea's nuclear weapon program crosses a red line. In this connection, China's role is very important because China is in a position to make a significantly positive contribution to the resolution of North Korean nuclear problem. China has already made big contribution to the
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jin Sok Boon, for his sharing. Now, we will come to the last section of session 2, where we have a discussion, Dr. Syed Mahmood Ali, to share on his viewpoints on the 4 speakers sharing as well. Thank you so much, and then pleased to have Dr. Syed Mahmood Ali, who is the Associate Fellow of Institute of China Studies, University of Malaya. So please, Dr. Syed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to this academic gathering. By contributing a thoughtful analysis, eminent scholars we have just seen and heard have simplified my task. The 20th Congress was followed by the 14th November Bali meeting between President Xi Jinping and Joseph Biden. The Foreign Ministry of China's statement, diverging notably from the White House press release, stated, and I quote, President Biden reaffirmed that a stable and prosperous China is good for the United States and the world. The United States respects China's system and does not seek to change it. The United States does not seek a new Cold War, does not seek to revitalize alliances against China, does not support Taiwan independence, does not support two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan, and has no intention to have a conflict with China. More, the US side has no intention to seek a decoupling from China, to hold China's economic and development or to contain China, unquote. That was what President Biden was said to have said. A month later, on 16 December, a few days ago, the USA added 36 Chinese technology firms to its entity list on grounds of national security, prohibiting any transactions with or investments into these firms. China's Ministry of Commerce said, and I quote, the US side has overstretched the concept of national security, abused export controls and other measures, and used state power to expand the crackdown on Chinese companies and institutions, typical market distorting and economic bullying practices, unquote. The next day, 17th this month, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken launched the Department of State's China House, insisting, and I quote, China House will ensure the US government is able to responsibly manage our competition with the People's Republic of China and advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system. Our goal in creating China House is to help deliver on elements of the administration's approach to the PRC. China House is a key component of our modernization agenda, which is focused on equipping the department to meet the challenges and seize the opportunities of the decade ahead. The department is committed, the Department of State is committed to ensuring we have the talent, tools, and resources to successfully execute US policy and strategy towards the PRC as the most complex and consequential geopolitical challenge we face, unquote. President Biden is now preparing to promulgate the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, with the defense budget rising by 8% to $857.9 billion, which would be roughly $45 billion more than what he had himself requested. It is focused on, and I quote, the most vital national security priorities for the United States, including strategic competition with Russia and China. That's why, unquote, I'd conclude that post-20th CPC Congress, China today confronts a more focused USA. Given the primate's determination to extend its primacy and China's determination not to subordinate itself again, the USA is afflicted with profound displacement anxiety to constrain China short of crossing the conflict threshold. And that seems to be the case irrespective of what China might say or decide to do. This is possibly as zero-sum as it gets. The structural and systemic contention between the current primate and its formerly proclaimed peer competitor leaves us anxiously watching from the sidelines. Systemic transitional fluidity, fraught at any time at all, has rarely been at risk as risk-prone and potentially dangerous as it is today. Thanks very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Said, for your sharing. Due to time overrun, we will not be able to take the question and answers. So that concludes our second session of the dialogue today. So the first session, we have speakers talking about China's high quality development and Chinese style modernization. And the second session, we have speakers talking about China's diplomacy after the 20th CPC Congress. So now we would like to, So again, yeah, we would like to thank the speakers, Professor Kerry Brown, Professor John Gong, Dr. Jayan Menon, Professor Liu Ying, Dr. Anna Du, Professor Klaus Laris, Dr. Chao Hai, Professor Rana Mita, Professor Jin Suk Boon, and Dr. Said Mahmood Ali for your time and your sharing. Next, we will have the President of Center for New Inclusive Asia Malaysia, Mr. Kok Keng Kee, to make his closing remarks.
Thank you, Eugene. Distinguished speakers, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. A very good evening to everyone. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank all of you for participating in YAP 2022. I hope the webinar has helped you gain a better understanding of China and the world after the 20th CPC National Congress. I would also like to express our deep gratitude to the panel of speakers and discussants for taking time off your very busy schedule to share with us your expert views and insight on China and the world after the 20th CPC National Congress. And thank you, Eugene, for doing a great job in moderating the webinar. In less than 10 days, we will be bidding farewell to 2022, a year of unprecedented turbulence and instability since the end of the Cold War. As we are about to usher in the new year, the world is still faced with a lot of uncertainties. No one knows when or how the Ukraine war will end, whether there will be another new variant of COVID-19, or how soon soaring inflation in many countries will come down. It is often quipped that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold, reflecting how mighty the US is in the world economy. Today, when China sneezes, the world catches a cold too, as China is now the world's second largest economy and the global manufacturing powerhouse pivotal to the global supply chain, with more than 140 countries and regions as its major trading partners. Hence, the importance of the 20th CPC National Congress and the purpose of this webinar. President Xi Jinping was elected to a third term as Secretary General of CPC at the 20th CPC National Congress held in October, with a new 7-member Politburo Standing Committee as the Communist Party of China entered its second centennial. China now accounts for 18.5% of world GDP and has contributed close to 30% of global growth annually for the last 10 years. The 20th CPC National Congress undoubtedly carries far-reaching implications for the world, which many say is at the cusp of a new global order. President Xi's report to the 20th CPC National Congress laid the blueprint for China's technology and innovation-driven high-quality development for the next 5 years and beyond. The report also set out the guiding principles for Chinese-style modernization in building China to a modern socialist country in all aspects. Soon after the 20th CPC National Congress, President Xi Jinping attended the G20 summit in Bali. On November 16, he met Joe Biden in person for the first time for a 3-hour meeting, apart from holding a series of side meetings with other world leaders. Many deemed that the meeting President Xi had at the G20 summit signified China's return to the global stage after close to 3 years of COVID lockdown. Some Western China observers have noticed that of late, China's diplomatic tone appears to have changed. There are now more engagements within China and the West, in particular, and the world at large. President Xi made an official visit to Saudi Arabia on December 7 to attend the first China-Arab State Summit and the China Gulf Cooperation Council Summit. And Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, plans to visit China early next year. China has just lifted stringent COVID-19 quarantine measures, and cities in China are gradually returning to the normal way of life. It was reported in Hong Kong news media that foreign visitors to China will no longer be subject to quarantine in designated quarantine facilities beginning January 3rd next year. Nevertheless, China is now going through a testing time as the number of people tested COVID positive have surged dramatically. The world is thus looking with anxious and watchful eyes on how presidency and its new team will navigate China in a world that is facing rising uncertainties with intensified geostrategic competition. I hope this webinar has helped to clarify some of the issues I highlighted above. Personally, I'm optimistic that China will stage a V-shaped economic rebound in the second half of 2023. Finally, before we end the webinar, I would like to take this opportunity to wish everyone a happy, healthy, prosperous New Year. To our Christian friends, Merry Christmas. Today is also the Chinese Winter Solstice Festival. To all Chinese participants and audience, Happy Winter Solstice Festival. 今年是冬至，我仅代表主办单位祝大家冬至快乐，健康平安，每一天都过得顺顺利利，圆圆满满。谢谢 ，Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koh King Kee, for your insights and also the wishes. So that we have come to the end of the dialogue today. And on behalf of the organizers, we would like to thank all your participation and your attendance today with us. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again in our next event. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.